All right, in this video, we're going to continue discussing the characteristics of these biological macromolecules. And in this video, we're going to talk about proteins. We'll think about what they're composed of, what their structure is, and how they function, or what their functions are in living things. So, proteins, again, are another item that we think of a lot of the time when we think of nutrition. So here's an example of some proteins. We've got like a pork loin or some salmon steaks or chicken breasts. These are sources of protein that we eat. And generally when we're eating protein, more often than not, we're eating the muscle tissue of another animal. So muscle is particularly high in protein. But that doesn't mean that's the only place we find protein. So proteins are a major component of all cells and tissues. All right, muscle, it tends to be the source of protein that we eat, but no matter what organism we look at, it's composed of a lot of proteins. Okay, so let's think about what these proteins are doing for organisms. The list of protein functions is really endless, and I think it's important for students to have a few examples of functions that proteins perform when they're going to discuss biology. So I'll give you a few examples of some functions, and then at the end of our presentation today, we'll look at some specific examples. So in general, proteins do a number of things. One thing they can do is they can act as an enzyme. So one thing a protein can be is an enzyme. Enzymes are proteins that make chemical reactions happen. So in biological organisms, we need all sorts of chemical reactions to happen. It's important that they happen fast so that biology can work, and enzymes perform that role for cells. All right, another function is that proteins can act as antibodies. An antibody is a special protein that helps your immune system detect foreign substances so that your immune system can remove those foreign substances from your body. Hopefully, your immune system will remove them fast enough that it keeps you from getting sick. Right, so proteins can be enzymes. They make chemical reactions happen. Proteins can be antibodies. They detect these foreign substances. Proteins can act as structural proteins. They will add structure and support to cells. We'll talk a lot about that later in the course. Proteins can act as transporters. They can move things around within cells or in and out of cells. We'll talk a lot about some proteins that act as transporters later on in the course. Proteins can act as messengers. That basically they can send signals between or within cells. So these are some examples of protein functions. But again, proteins perform all kinds of functions. There are just a couple of functions in living organisms that aren't performed by proteins. But any other thing, we can find a protein involved in that function. So proteins are critically important. Almost every function depends on a protein, and so that's why we're going to pay so much attention to them. Okay, so let's think about what we make proteins out of. So just like all the biological macromolecules, they are polymers. Again, poly just means many. Mers is like units. So we want to think about what are the individual units, the monomers that we make the protein out of. So protein monomers are these things called amino acids. Amino acids are the monomers for proteins. Amino acids have a common structure. So let's look at an amino acid structure. An amino acid looks like this. It essentially has three major parts. One part of the amino acid is this NH2 group, the amino group. Then on the opposite end over here, there's this C attached to an oxygen through a double bond, and then it's also attached to this other oxygen with a hydrogen. This is a hydroxyl group, and so we call this a COOH or carboxyl group. So on one end of the amino acid, there's this amino group. On the other end of the amino acid, there's this carboxyl group. And then in the middle, there's this carbon attached to this thing that we call an R group or a variable group. And so every single amino acid looks like this, but there are different kinds of amino acids, and they vary in what this R group looks like. So these R groups have different chemical structures, and that makes different amino acids. But every single amino acid has this amino group, then a carbon in the middle, and then this carboxyl group on the other side. So amino acids always share this part, and then the R group is a little bit different. So in biology, there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. Again, they share that common structure, and then the R group looks a little bit different. So if you ever wonder about an amino acid, you can always look it up in a table, and you can see the structures of all those R groups. So here we can see, again, every amino acid has this amino group, then there's the carbon in the middle, and then there's this COOH, the carboxyl group on the other end. And the part that's colored differently is the R group. The R group can be as simple as a single hydrogen atom, or it can be really complex and have these ring structures like these ones down here. Some are really big, some are really small. So the R groups are different depending on the amino acid. You'll never, in my class, be asked to memorize those amino acids. If we ever ask a question about them, we'll look at a table and figure out the appropriate answer. Okay. So we take those amino acid monomers and we put them together into a big polymer to make a protein. So here's an example of a protein. Each one of these little beads along this string represents one amino acid. So we're going to take a whole bunch of amino acids, we're going to connect them together into long chains. Maybe the last amino acids, we can see the specific identities of them: phenylalanine, leucine, serine, cysteine. Right? And based on the order in which we attach those amino acids with their different structures together, we'll get proteins that do different things. The reason proteins do different things is based upon their shape. So let's next think about the structure of a protein, or the shape that the protein takes. So we'll start by connecting together a whole bunch of those amino acid monomers into a long chain. Now we want to think about, how does it fold up into a shape to perform a function? So protein structure comes in 4 steps. We're going to call them the primary, secondary, tertiary, which just means third, and quaternary, which means fourth. So the primary step, the primary structure right here, is just the amino acid sequence. Again, we've got these beads that represent our amino acids, and we just connect them together in order, whatever order the cell decides is appropriate. So that's the primary structure, the order of the amino acids. Once those amino acids are connected together, their R groups, the variable part of them, will interact with one another in certain ways, and we'll get some specific structures. There's 2 structures. We might get this twisting right here, or these sort of long flat structures here. We call these alpha helixes and beta sheets, and that's our secondary structure. So secondary structure is the folding up of that chain of amino acids into either the alpha helix or this thing called a beta sheet. And that's done because of hydrogen bonding. So we start with our chain, then we get twisting or the formation of these sheets, and then we move on to the tertiary structure. Tertiary structure is when those sheets and alpha helices twist up with one another in just the right way, and we get this folded up 3D structure of a single amino acid chain. So the tertiary structure is the final 3D structure of that folded up chain. Some proteins, not all, but some proteins have one more level of structure called quaternary structure. Quaternary structure is when 2 or more of these folded up amino acid chains come together to perform their final function. So again, some proteins require 2 different chains to work together. Some proteins can function by themselves at this tertiary structure level. So again, we started by just thinking about these amino acids. We connect them together into chains, we fold them up, and the final shape, tertiary or quaternary structure, provides the activity that the protein will have. The shape determines its function. Okay, so to end, let's think about some specific examples of proteins. So here I've got an image that I pulled from Wikipedia that shows the structure of a whole bunch of different proteins. So if you look around in this image, you can see that every protein has a different shape. Again, its shape will help determine its function. And so I want to pull out 3 or 4 of these and just think about what are the functions of some of these. So let's start with an example here. Here's what an antibody looks like. An antibody has this protein chain folded up in this way. There's sort of 3 major lobes to it. Okay, it's being held together. Again, an antibody's job is to bind to stuff that doesn't belong in your body, marking it, and sort of telling your immune system that it should destroy it so you don't get sick. And antibodies can only do that because they have this specific shape. Okay, so that's one example of a protein, an antibody. Another example is this enzyme called pepsin. So over here we've got pepsin. We zoom in, here's what the pepsin protein structure looks like. Again, it's that chain of amino acids all folded up onto itself. It looks very different than an antibody. Pepsin's job is to digest or break apart proteins. So it breaks proteins apart into amino acids. So when you eat a big steak or a piece of fish, when you eat that protein, pepsin is one of the enzymes in your body that helps you digest it. All right, what's another example? Here we've got an actin filament. So actin is a primary component of muscles and is used for muscle contractions. So here's what actin looks like. It's a long, skinny protein. Again, it's folded up from that long chain of amino acids. And when it's folded up in this way, it can interact with other proteins in a way so that you can move your muscles. So actin is used in muscles and it allows us to move. It's another great example. And so let's think about one more. How about this insulin protein? I'm sure you've all heard of insulin before. Here's a picture of the insulin protein. It's quite small. Again, it's a chain of amino acids folded up on itself. Okay? And insulin's job is a signaling protein. So insulin sends signals from one part of your body to another. Insulin's job is to send a signal to your muscles and your liver when you have a whole bunch of sugar in your bloodstream. That sugar is a good source of energy for your muscles, or your liver can store it for later. So insulin tells your muscles and your liver to take that sugar out of your bloodstream and store it so that they can use it later. And if we don't have insulin working correctly, that's when we're diabetic, right? So those individuals have to inject insulin to control their blood sugar levels. So those are just a few examples of specific proteins and what they do. Again, there's endless examples of proteins. And when you're talking about biology, I hope you'll have a couple that you find interesting and you can talk about how important that protein is to some function in a living thing. But we'll talk about a whole bunch more examples as we go through the semester. All right, so we'll end there. As always, give me a shout on the discussion boards or by email if you have any questions, and I will talk to you again soon.